Imagine a ledger, bound in cracked leather the color of dried blood, tucked away in a dimly lit archive in Charleston. The names inside are written in perfect looping cursive, each one a ghost of someone who should have lived but didn't, not in any official record, not in any census, not even in whispered memory. For decades, scholars dismissed it as a simple record of commerce, the mundane arithmetic of human lives bought and sold like livestock. But one day, a librarian named Dorothy Hayes noticed something impossible. 47 families vanished. No trace. No evidence they ever breathed, just empty spaces where entire existences once were. And it was then that the chilling truth began to emerge. A man had arrived in Charleston in 1851, wealthy, composed, with no history, and yet with a singular, impossible purpose. He was listed as Thomas Garrett, businessman, yet no one knew where he came from. His accent hinted at a life lived across countless cities, yet he spoke of no home, no childhood, no lineage. He moved with a quiet authority, observing, cataloging, noting every detail of a city built on rigid hierarchy and the brutal calculus of human lives. His wealth spoke louder than words, yet it was his silence, his impenetrable calm, that unnerved those who tried to pry. Within months, he had purchased a townhouse on Trad Street, paid entirely in cash, and entered Charleston society with a gentle grace that disarmed suspicion. He attended parties, dined with elites, offered polite conversation, but his past remained a shadow, unreadable, untouchable. Then he began buying people, not slaves as labor, not for profit, not for power, but families, entire families, often scattered by cruel sales, sometimes reunited after months of patient tracking, purchased at premium prices, quietly moved to isolated properties miles from the nearest neighbor. No overseers, no locks, no coercion. They vanished from the public ledger, leaving the world behind without explanation. It was not business. It was something else, something forbidden, something dangerous. And in the shadows of this city, a man named Lawrence Fitzgerald noticed. A slave trader, meticulous, obsessed with numbers, he saw the pattern where others saw chaos. 47 purchases, yet no return, no output, no profit, just disappearance. The ledger of human lives left untouched, while something secret, something revolutionary, unfolded beyond the eyes of Charleston's rigid society. What kind of man could spend years, vast sums, and endless effort to undo the system itself, while remaining invisible? The answer would terrify them, and transform anyone who dared to know it. November 1851. The air in Charleston had finally cooled, crisp with autumn, yet heavy with the faint tang of sawdust and sweat from the auction house on Chalmers Street. It was here that Thomas Garrett made his first public act that would haunt the city's memory. Families were presented like livestock, catalogued with precision. Names, ages, skills, health, all reduced to a bid, a number, a transaction. The crowd murmured, planters and merchants eyeing their next acquisition. And then came Lot 72. William, a strong field hand of 35, Mary, his young wife, skilled in domestic work, and their two daughters, Clara Ara and Eliza, 7 and 9. A complete family. A rare commodity. The auctioneer's gavel struck sharply, demanding bids. Garrett sat quietly at the back, his presence almost imperceptible, yet his gaze absorbed everything. The bidding rose slowly, the numbers climbing. Then, as the room slowed, he raised his hand. $1,800. A few heads turned. A businessman, yes, but not one known for labor purchases. The room stilled as he matched, then exceeded every counteroffer. $2,000. The gavel fell. The family belonged to him. Yet, unlike every other transaction, Garrett's interest was not profit nor exploitation. He insisted that the family be moved to his farm inland, and a Bible be included with their belongings. A strange request, unnecessary for mere commerce. The ledger would record them as sold, yet their true journey had only just begun. The next morning, William and Mary, the children clinging to each other, were transported under the quiet watch of Garrett's agents to Colleton County. By the city's records, they simply ceased to exist. Gone. a phantom presence. It was the first ripple in what would become a tidal wave of subversive acts. Over the months, Garrett continued. Elderly couples, young mothers with infants, brothers separated by cruel sales, all purchased, all transported to isolated farms. No one worked in fields for profit. No overseers imposed brutality. No outside world intruded. In a society where lives were property, he was the first man to treat them as humans. And yet he did it entirely in secret, invisible to the prying eyes of Charleston society. Lawrence Fitzgerald, observant and unnerved, began tracking Garrett. It didn't make sense, financially, socially, politically. The man was risking everything, his fortune, his reputation, his very life. But there it was, a pattern emerging through the ledger's blank spaces, a hidden network orchestrated with the precision of a master strategist. And the city, blind to the chaos Garrett was subtly dismantling, continued to hum with normalcy, unaware of the invisible revolt unfolding just beyond its streets. Every purchase was more than a transaction. It was a silent act of liberation. Every family moved was a spark in a dark world, a rebellion cloaked in civility, a shadowy challenge to the very foundations of Charleston society. And those who noticed, like Fitzgerald, could feel it in their bones. This was dangerous knowledge. Once known, nothing would ever feel the same. By the spring of 1852, the city records showed nothing unusual, yet the edges of reality were bending on Garrett's farms. Colleton, Berkeley, and the other secluded properties became ghostly sanctuaries. To the outside world, they were modest, quiet, empty. But those who watched from the shadows, men like Patrick Hughes, hired by Fitzgerald, saw something else entirely. People moved freely, without overseers, without chains. Men, women, children tended gardens, cared for chickens, repaired cabins. Work was done, yes, but only enough to sustain life. Nothing for profit. No cotton fields stretching into the horizon, no tobacco-curing sheds, no signs of the economy's relentless grind. Just freedom, quiet and precise. And the nights, they were more unsettling than the days. Hughes recorded lamplights burning past midnight, voices in the darkness reciting, singing, reading. Children huddled over small books, their eyes catching the faint glow, learning words that had been forbidden to them. In a society built on suppression, knowledge itself was a weapon. The freedom Garrett offered was not only escape from labor, it was the reclamation of thought, of identity. Every lesson, every whispered reading was a rebellion against a world that demanded obedience and silence. The isolation was deliberate. Each farm was hidden, carefully chosen, one at the end of a pine-choked road, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor, another backed by impenetrable swamps, where the cries of unseen birds marked the edges of the world. A third, nestled between steep hills, invisible from any main road, not accidental, not careless. Each location was a sanctuary, a deliberate shield from observation, from interference, from those who would seek to reclaim what Garrett had liberated. Fitzgerald, reading Hughes's reports, felt an unshakable tension. This was no ordinary man, no ordinary plan. There was intent behind the quiet, a philosophy woven through each action. Garrett was creating something the world wasn't ready to see, a network of living people freed from commerce, freed from fear, freed from the expectation that their lives belonged to someone else. The ledger, the auctions, the secluded farms, they were the scaffolding of an invisible revolution, and yet the more Fitzgerald watched, the more he understood how dangerous it was to know. Knowledge, in Garrett's world, was both salvation and curse. To see the truth was to feel its weight pressing down on the conscience. Who else could act like this and survive? Who else could orchestrate liberation while remaining unseen? The answer haunted Fitzgerald. Almost no one. Garrett moved through the edges of society like a ghost, and each family he touched became a silent testament to courage that operated entirely in darkness. The city carried on, blind and arrogant, unaware that a quiet rebellion was unfolding right under its nose. And Fitzgerald, compelled by curiosity, morality, and fear, realized that he was now part of it. Once you saw Garrett's work, There was no going back. You could never look at the world the same way again. It was October 1854, and Charleston's social season was in full swing. Margaret Hensley's grand dining room glowed under flickering candlelight, crystal glasses catching reflections like shards of sunlight. The air smelled faintly of roasted meats and polished wood, a carefully curated veneer of civility masking the rot underneath. Guests, wealthy and self-assured, discussed politics, marriages, and the perpetual problem of managing their human property, as if they were speaking of livestock rather than flesh and blood. Thomas Garrett sat among them, polite, attentive, unassuming, yet his presence carried a subtle gravity, a quiet power that demanded the attention of those who refused to look too closely. As dessert arrived, the conversation took its predictable turn. Mr. Henry Sutton, a prominent planter, began boasting about disciplining his laborers, selling a few to make an example, reinforcing obedience with the casual cruelty of a man who had never considered what it meant to break families apart. Garrett listened, his expression calm, his eyes calculating. Then, without raising his voice, he asked a question that felt like a blade sliding between ribs. "When you separated those brothers," he said, "have you considered what that cost them? What it cost the family left behind?" The room fell silent. Murmurs of unease rippled through the guests. Conversations about profit and discipline hung in the air like smoke, suddenly exposed for what they were. Excuses for cruelty. Sutton's pride faltered, his face darkening. Garrett's voice remained gentle, almost academic, but every word carried the weight of an accusation no one dared make openly. He spoke of human desire versus property value, of broken spirits, of the unseen cost of obedience enforced by fear. "When you see your laborers as commodities," Garrett said, "you blind yourself to their lives. And when those lives break, the cost is borne silently, invisibly, but it is no less real." The elite around the table shifted uncomfortably. They were confronted not with law, not with threat, but with the unflinching gaze of truth. Garrett's quiet philosophy was dangerous precisely because it could not be legislated against. It demanded moral reckoning, exposed complicity, and left no room for justification. Caroline Hensley, watching from the corner, later described the moment as physically oppressive, as though the thick Charleston air had congealed into something heavier than mere atmosphere. Fitzgerald, hearing the second-hand account, felt the chill deep in his bones. Garrett's power was subtle, surgical. He did not raise a hand, he did not call names, yet the effect was undeniable. The room had shifted, morality had been measured, and the cracks in the veneer of society exposed. Garrett was not just liberating families in secret. He was probing the very conscience of those who enslaved them, reminding the world of the humanity it had chosen to ignore. And in that quiet, morally charged confrontation, Fitzgerald understood the full scope of Garrett's audacity. This was not mere eccentricity. This was a calculated challenge to the very foundations of Charleston society, a hidden revolution enacted with cash, patience, and conscience, one family at a time. By 1855, the outlines of Thomas Garrett's operation had grown unmistakably complex, yet remained invisible to all but the most attentive eyes. He was no longer a man quietly purchasing families. He had become the architect of a hidden world. Charleston streets bustled with merchants, bankers, and planters, all convinced they understood the flow of wealth, of human lives. And yet Garrett moved in shadows, quietly reassembling what society had deliberately torn apart. Fitzgerald, now obsessed, tracked every ledger, every shipment, every unusual purchase. The patterns were staggering. Families scattered across Georgia and South Carolina, separated for decades, were being meticulously reunited on remote properties, each hand-picked plot chosen not for productivity but for privacy. Crops existed, yes, but only enough to sustain life. The real wealth was knowledge, literacy, and a kind of freedom invisible to the legal eye. Children studied in the dim lamplight, learning letters, history, and moral reasoning, skills outlawed for people society claimed as property. Garrett's warehouses of books, primers, and literature were more valuable than any cotton bale in Charleston. He coordinated his purchases with surgical precision, traveling alone in an unassuming carriage, delivering supplies and guidance, yet never revealing the scope of his plans. Neighbors occasionally glimpsed him, calm and polite, but the families remained ghostly in absence, appearing only when they were ready, never exposed to the public gaze. Fitzgerald realized something chilling. Garrett had created a private society, parallel to Charleston itself, a self-contained ecosystem, functioning entirely outside the cruel logic of commerce. Even lawmen like Sheriff Thorne were drawn into this subtle tension. Garrett anticipated scrutiny with uncanny foresight, placing decoy properties in plain sight, while the true sanctuaries remained hidden, carefully camouflaged by swamp, forest, and isolation. Any attempt at intrusion was neutralized with a mixture of audacious charm, strategic deception, and almost preternatural timing. Each family he liberated became part of an invisible ledger, documented not for profit, but for legacy. Fitzgerald now faced a choice. Every day he lingered near the truth. He risked exposure, yet each observation deepened his understanding. And it was in this crucible of secrecy, danger, and revelation that he began to realize the true power of Garrett's work, not merely in saving lives, but in awakening conscience, even in the hearts of those who had spent a lifetime blind. Now, viewers, if you understand the weight of choice, the cost of morality, and the power of one man's courage, comment below, "I see the path." And then again, "I see the path." Repeat it. Let it anchor your mind to the reality that even in the darkest systems, agency is possible. By 1857, Thomas Garrett's work had grown from quiet rebellion into something approaching legend, though only whispered about in the corridors of Charleston and along the isolated roads he frequented. Families appeared whole again, children could read and write, and the world of commerce, obsessed with profit, efficiency, and ownership, remained oblivious. Yet Garrett himself was becoming increasingly elusive, a figure who seemed to exist simultaneously in the bustling streets of the city and the dense forests of Colleton and Berkeley counties. Fitzgerald, despite his moral fascination, began to notice the pattern of Garrett's absences. Weeks would pass when the man simply vanished. No carriage tracks, no shipments, nothing. And yet, the families were safe, fed, and learning. He realized Garrett's operation was not just secret, it was autonomous. Every property had systems, trusted intermediaries, and discrete routines designed to function without oversight. He was orchestrating freedom like a symphony, each family a note, every isolated farm a chord in a music that only Garrett fully understood. Then came the final act. On a moonless night in late April, Garrett disappeared from Charleston as completely as he had first arrived. No farewell, no record, no trace. Witnesses reported seeing his townhouse shuttered at dusk, candles extinguished, and not a carriage in sight. The city awoke the next morning to an empty home, a silent street, and the echo of a man who had rewritten the rules of morality and justice without leaving a single clue to his fate. For Fitzgerald, the shock was profound. He had glimpsed a man who not only challenged the foundations of society, but did so with the patience, intelligence, and audacity to avoid detection entirely. Garrett had not merely defied law. He had constructed a moral sanctuary beyond the reach of corruption, greed, and cruelty. Every ledger entry, every purchased family, every hidden schoolhouse was proof of a network so precise it bordered on the impossible. And yet, in the absence of Garrett, the question haunted everyone. Where had he gone? Was he hiding, fleeing, or had he built a system so complete that he no longer needed to be present at all? Whispers began to circulate of a man who had become more shadow than flesh, a myth walking alongside history, visible only to those willing to look closely. Families continued to thrive, unseen, growing strong, literate, free. And for those who knew even a fraction of the truth, a dangerous thought lingered. Garrett had vanished, but the world he created endured. The aftermath of Garrett's disappearance was a silence that spoke louder than any announcement. Charleston's elite, preoccupied with their own interests, whispered about his absence, but few dared connect the dots. Fitzgerald alone carried the burden of knowing the truth, and it twisted inside him like a living thing, part awe, part guilt, part fear. He had been a witness to an extraordinary moral act, one that upended every assumption about wealth, power, and human nature. And yet, he could not share it. To do so would risk everything: his status, his safety, the lives of those he had glimpsed thriving under Garrett's protection. In the weeks and months that followed, Fitzgerald noticed subtle changes among those families that Garrett had freed. Children, once quiet and subdued under oppression, now spoke with clarity and curiosity. Parents, who had lived with the constant weight of fear, began to reclaim dignity and agency. It was invisible progress, almost imperceptible to outsiders, yet it radiated a quiet power that could never be unmade. It was a power Garrett had cultivated deliberately, a hidden revolution conducted not with weapons or laws, but with trust, patience, and the audacity to believe in the worth of every human soul. Fitzgerald began to understand the terrifying scope of Garrett's philosophy. The man had rewritten the rules of a society built on dehumanization. He had weaponized compassion against an entrenched system of cruelty, and in doing so he had become both untouchable and morally unassailable. No ledger, no court, no law could ever measure what Garrett had done. He had built a parallel reality, one where human beings were not property but people, free to shape their destinies beyond the prying eyes of Charleston's hierarchy. But there was another darker realization lurking beneath Fitzgerald's admiration. Such acts of invisible justice are not without cost. The moral tension, the weight of secrets, and the knowledge of what could have been left Fitzgerald restless. He began to question his own complicity, the compromises he had made, and the society he had chosen to protect. The question lingered: if one man could dismantle oppression in secret, what responsibility did that leave for the rest of the world? And here, dear viewer, is where you must pause and look inward. The story is no longer about Garrett alone. It is about every man who witnesses injustice, every man who knows the truth, and every man who must decide whether to act or remain silent. If you understand this, comment the words "Shadows Awaken" twice. Let them anchor your awareness. Mark the moment where knowledge begins to reshape your perception of what is possible, and signal the commitment to see beneath the surface of the world you think you know. Because Garrett's greatest lesson was never written in ledgers or newspapers. It was a lesson whispered in the lives he touched. True power is quiet, deliberate, and dangerous to those who cling to the old ways. And those who grasp it understand that freedom is not given. It is taken, orchestrated, and protected with intelligence and courage. Perfect. Now we reach the final descent, where mystery, moral gravity, and the haunting echo of Garrett's choices converge. And then, just as suddenly as he appeared, Thomas Garrett vanished. There was no farewell, no explanation, no trace beyond the lives he had touched and the families he had freed. Charleston's streets buzzed with speculation. Some claimed he returned north, retreating to the anonymity of a world less constrained by the rigid hierarchies of the South. Others whispered of darker possibilities: death at sea, a secret exile, or even a hidden identity, assumed to continue his work elsewhere. Yet no evidence ever surfaced. No letters, no property transfers, no obituary, only absence. And absence, in its way, is louder than any declaration. Fitzgerald, left behind with the ledger, the reports, and the echoes of Garrett's moral defiance, understood that he had been entrusted with dangerous knowledge. Knowledge that could unmake men who measured life in profit margins, that could shatter the comfortable illusions of a society built on control and fear. He was now both witness and custodian. Every family freed, every child learning to read in secret, every reunion orchestrated in shadow, was a reminder that the world could be manipulated, not through brute force, but through deliberate hidden action. Charleston, in its surface calm, continued its commerce and its cruelty, unaware of the quiet revolution Garrett had sown. And yet, like seeds scattered in fertile soil, the effects could not be fully contained. Generations later, the families he saved would tell fragments of the story, stories of a man who arrived like a shadow, who bought them not to exploit, but to liberate, and who then disappeared into the ether, leaving only the power of choice behind. The myth of Thomas Garrett grew, whispered quietly in corners, debated cautiously in polite society, yet always marked by awe and fear. Because to understand Garrett's work is to recognize a truth that challenges every comfortable assumption. One person, acting with clarity, courage, and discretion, can bend the course of human lives against the current of history. And this is where you, watching now, must confront the mirror Garrett held up to society and to the self. The ledger is no longer physical, it is inside your mind, your conscience, your moral vision. How will you act when you see injustice? How will you move when no one else dares? Garrett disappeared, yes, but the pattern remains. The lesson is yours to wield. Influence, compassion, and courage are the tools of the unseen. The power to rewrite the story is never given. It is claimed quietly, deliberately, dangerously. Remember his example. Let it unsettle you, let it awaken you. Because once you know the truth of Garrett, once you understand what it takes to free even a single soul in a world built on chains, nothing is ever the same again. The ledger may be closed, the man vanished, but the shadow of his choices lingers. A quiet reminder. Liberation is always possible, but only for those willing to act in the dark, where history cannot see and only courage lights the way. And then, as if swallowed by the night itself, Thomas Garrett vanished. No letters, no farewells, no hint of where he went. Charleston awoke to his absence like a city exhaling into silence. Some whispered he fled north, melting into anonymity among the bustling cities, blending with a world where lineage and social rank mattered less. Others suggested darker fates, an accident at sea, a clandestine exile, even death assumed to preserve secrecy. But no trace ever emerged. The only proof of his existence remained in the lives he had touched. The families reunited, the children learning to read, the quiet dignity of those he had freed. Fitzgerald, left behind with the ledger and a conscience forever altered, realized the weight of what he knew. Garrett's work was not merely illegal or eccentric, it was revolutionary. It defied the logic of profit, the cruelty of societal norms, and the very foundations of a world built on ownership of human life. Each family Garrett purchased and liberated was a defiance of history itself, a ripple thrown across the stagnant waters of Charleston society. Fitzgerald understood that witnessing Garrett's deeds had transformed him. Knowledge, he now knew, carried responsibility, and inaction could be complicity. Charleston moved on, unaware of the invisible rebellion that had passed through its streets. Yet the impact of Garrett's actions endured like an unseen current. Families once torn apart flourished quietly, carrying forward stories that could never fully be told. Legends grew in whispers, of a man who arrived like a shadow, buying human lives to restore them, and then disappearing like smoke, leaving only the memory of freedom. The moral of his actions was unmistakable. One determined individual, acting with precision and courage, could bend the arc of history in secret. And this is where the story touches you. The ledger is no longer in a leather-bound archive. It exists in the choices you make when injustice presents itself. Garrett's life challenges the comfortable illusion that one person cannot change the world. He acted quietly, deliberately, dangerously, but with purpose. He reminds us that liberation, justice, and true influence are often forged in darkness, invisible to the many, understood only by those with courage. Once you know his story, nothing is ever the same. Garrett vanished, but the shadow of his deeds lingers, an eternal question. When faced with oppression, with cruelty, with broken lives, what will you do? The world is full of chains. Freedom exists only for those willing to act where history cannot see, and only courage can illuminate the way.